I'd been to a NRCS event down in Billings, and we talked about no-till, and I just said, Dad, we're going to do it, and that's what we did.
Well, I was looking at buying a disc ripper, and I got to visiting with some neighbors, and they were dabbling in this no-till, and I thought, heck, I'm gonna try no-till before I buy a disc ripper, and I'm glad I did that. So now I saved a bunch of money and never bought a disc ripper.
We started with no-till on dry land, quite a while ago, I guess. My grandfather was actually, no-tilled some in the 80s on certain pieces of ground that kind of responded better to it. We thought, well, we can take that down to the irrigated and quit spending so much money on diesel and tractor hours.
That is one of the main reasons why no-till beets started coming around in this area. I can't remember what year it was, if it was 14 or 15. We had some extreme wind and a lot of soil moved. I had beet fields that were in ground similar to this that really mellowed out, got sugary, and you could just see those beets holding on for dear life.
You never see it blowing across the highway anymore, so that's a good thing. Well, the benefits that I see from reduced or zero tillage, I guess, is a lot of it's cost savings. In this business, sometimes the only money to be made is the money you didn't spend. And I think the fact that we can raise as good or better of crops while spending less money is important.
Because my neighbors are out plowing today and I'm not. There's one farm down, I think they have 3 tractors in one field. So 10 gallons an hour per tractor, at $2.50 a gallon. Probably the $15 to $20 an hour per the person in the tractor. Wear and tear, that's all money that I'm not spending today. I get just as good or better yield than I ever have, and I'm not spending any money to get that.
We've been in a steady uptrend on both yield and sugar and tonnage for quite a while here. On the no-till beets, I had one field that was following the hay made 37.4 ton. The one that was in my full rotation made about 39.5. I figure on the no-till beets, I'm probably saving around $100 to $120 an acre, in tillage applications and labor.
So I just roughly figure I'm probably saving $150 an acre by not doing any tillage. The yield as far as tonnage it was similar, but the sugar was definitely better in the no-till ground.
$150 an acre will buy a lot of planter attachments to make it work.
We're making so many fewer trips, so our carbon footprint, our emissions, and that whole thing it's been reduced. It's the whole system is just so much better than we used to do, just from the beginning to the end now.
So when you stop disturbing the soil, a lot of good things start to happen. You actually allow the soil to function as it's meant to.
The ground is so much more forgiving now too. Like, we really don't ever have much trouble with crusting, for the beets and other seeds that are hard to come up. And there's protection against the wind, so we don't have, beets blowing out.
But I have noticed the ground, it's firmer in the spring. It seems like the equipment stays up on the ground really nice. And digging beets in the fall, when it's wet, the trucks don't sink. They stay up really nice.
It seems like we're getting a lot more mineralization of nitrogen in the ground. It's not uncommon for me to have between 90 and 120 units of nitrogen available after a crop. We seem to be getting a lot more earthworms. And we went to one of the fields that I had beets in. My kids really like worms. So I dug up a shovelful and handed it to them and told them to pick all the worms out. And they had handfuls. In one shovelful, I bet we pulled out 40, 50 earthworms.
So yeah, this is excellent structure. You can see there's an earthworm right there. Best soil engineers on the planet. Evidence of earthworms are currently active because we haven't destroyed their habitat. So they're able to thrive and work for Cavin in his beet field out here. You see there's excellent structure, great soil aggregation. It's very crumbly. There's no signs of a compaction layer. The aggregation is good, down deeper right here. You want it to crumble like chocolate cake, just like that. And that's all, that structure's all built by microbes. It's never built by tillage. Tillage only makes it go backwards.
I always thought no-till would have the biggest problems in a wet year, but that turned to be exactly the opposite. This year there's a lot of problems with conventional tillage out there, flooding and washing, and we hardly had any problems. 3 or 4 days later, you'd never have known it. We got 6 inches in 1 hour. A few puddles, but we kept a lot of that water. Further up the road, it was washing across the road and up to the running boards on the pickup and coming out of the field. And the no-till makes it very resilient towards extreme weather events. And the no-till beets, you can tell the corners. They don't, even when it was hot, they didn't lay down. The leaves didn't sunburn. Fields in the area, they were conventional. The leaves started to sunburn last week. They needed water last week. And they got just as much rain or more rain than we did. There's a big difference there.
If you want water infiltration, you got to have soil structure. And so fields that have that good structure after really heavy rain, they don't pond. Water goes into the soil. Doesn't matter what the rain gauge says. It matters what actually went into the soil.
We really thought irrigation was going to be our biggest issue. And I still think everybody thinks that. We'll never be able, if we got one piece of straw out there in the whole field, the water won't make it to the end. And that's the farthest thing from the truth. But when we started doing it and you could irrigate every 14 days or every 21 days rather than every 7, a lot easier to irrigate. I just think all the water holding capacity, the barley straw and the corn stalks, things like that, it shades the ground. It slows up that water and lets it soak in.
Now that I've done this this is my 3rd year, the irrigation is the least of my worries. It irrigates nice. I don't have any trouble with getting the water through. The biggest challenge to me is just getting it planted the way it needs to be. It was just the first year I was planting corn on old ridges that I had put in 2 years before, and they were pretty hard, and I had a lot of trouble keeping the drill on top of the ridges. I really struggled with that whole first year, and I tried all sorts of different stuff, and I couldn't keep it on, and then I put a bar out the back of the drill the next year and ran some disc coulters, and that probably took care of 95% of my problem. Well, this drill is just set up it's got 3 adjustments for down pressure, and that's all I use. I never had to add anything to the drill, and that seemed to do the trick. These are the Schlegel closing wheels, and they actually work really well. They close the row and they kind of leave little clods, so it helps a lot with crusting. But the problem I'm having when I plant into the real heavy soils, when it's wet into the barley stubble, is there's so much surface here that they're trying to push and close the ground. They got to move a lot of ground, and I can't get it to close the V up. So I need to address that problem. And there's probably some closing wheels out there that would work better in that situation than these. And the biggest trouble I have is I don't have floating trash cleaners on my drill. And as wet as it was this year, if I moved too much residue, I'd plug up my trash cleaner. As soon as they'd start digging, they'd plug up, or I wasn't doing enough. So I ended up hairpinning some seed and not getting it planted as good as I wanted to. For me, going on in the future, I'm going to do a lot more baling the straw off until I can more fine-tune my trash cleaners and get some floating ones on there. I'd like to get to the point where I spread all the straw and keep it out there, but like I said, I've only been doing this 2 years, so I'll get there.
What I'd like to see him get to is eventually leaving more straw residue on the field, because that's a carbon source that will improve his soil organic matter, increase soil structure, increase infiltration and water holding capacity.
We had a friend that had kind of a no-till planter, and he was doing some no-till on his pivots, and it had opening coulters on it, and it worked, but those weren't my favorite. They didn't work very well. So we went to one with pretty good, aggressive row cleaners on it, and that's what we use still to this day, is floating row cleaners, but with weights on them. Not as good as the active downforce ones, but a lot cheaper. But they work pretty well. We use some aftermarket closing wheels, put liquid fertilizer in furrow. The first planters we used had spring downforce for the row units. I've got one with air pressure downforce now. You have to kind of check it here and there. If you've got a sandy field or a real clay one, I mean, it's going to vary a little bit, and it makes a difference even on how much liquid fertilizer I have in my tanks. You know, I mean, on harder ground, I never let my tanks go below a quarter, so I've got enough weight to hold the planter down so the row units aren't coming out of the ground.
My only thing is just, you don't need a big fancy planter. Don't let that hold you back. You know, I'm using, I guess, old equipment and getting more out of it. It's paid for itself years ago, and now it's just working for free. Other than I probably put a new set of discs on every 4 or 5 years now. And the first couple of years that you start no-tilling, your ground will be harder. Not terrible hard, but it's still building that structure. I don't know. The bugs aren't there, something isn't there, but by the third year, it's very mellow. You won't wear out a set of discs. Your new discs are thick, and yeah, they're sharp, but they're still thick. So when you're trying to get it into the ground, that first year, it's not like a razor blade, it's more like an axe. And so it's harder to kind of get those brand new blades in the ground. But if you get a couple of years wear on them, you get them thinned down a little bit. They may not be sharp, but they go in a little better. We've had to, on my insecticide boxes on the back of the planter, I'll put a stack of like Quikrete concrete mix in each one of them if we need a little bit more weight. I have some of the Schlegel wheels, and then I have some of the John Deere wheels. I can never tell the difference between the Schlegels and the regular John Deere wheels that's on it, the solid rubber. There are times when I think in wet spots that the Schlegels might work a little bit better, but I think that when I'm planting them, but you come back, 2 weeks later and everything came up. In this no-till, your sprayer is very important. Go out there and cook everything off right away so you don't have to deal with. And the green plants give you more problems than last year's residue. You could have a pile of residue from last year, that doesn't seem to be an issue, but a carpet of lettuce or whatever, I can't remember what they call that. It firms the ground up. Take care of your weeds and the growth in the spring, and you won't have an issue. Getting your truck drivers the year before trained to just drive straight down the field and out the field rather than making a big turn or something like that, because that'll affect your water for next year. Yeah, just go down to the end and turn around.
That's I think one of the biggest things to having success in this is make sure that your planter's ready to do the job. But I bought an $80,000 planter to plant no-till beets with. So I raised 240 acres of beets. It's going to take me 3 years to recoup that, just paying for the planter. So when I bought the planter, I set it up with Schlegel posi closed planter wheels. This last year I added, it's a firming wheel from Yetter that goes behind those and just basically kind of pats the ground. I have no down pressure on it. Aside from that, I have drag chains that I'll put down if necessary, but for the most part I can close the furrow good without worrying about that. I have Martin's floating row cleaners with the clean sweep on them. And that clean sweep is real nice for those, because if you feel like you need to put the row cleaners down harder to get through 5-6 inches of straw, you can just turn a lever in the cab and add more down pressure to the row cleaners. There's a lot of people that like just the rubber closing wheels. I don't think that does anything for you for your sidewall compaction. You're just adding pressure, and I don't want pressure. You try to keep trucks out of the field, so, especially like in beet harvest where you're typically wet. Now we have 2 carts that we run. They stay on the end, you load them out. Even if you do end up with some hairpinning, a lot of those seeds are gonna still germinate because there's that much more moisture available in the ground at seeding time. Hairpinning can be an issue on it, but it's less than what a guy thinks. So I think we see less weed pressure because you have the residue there to suppress the weeds. Having a diverse rotation and changing up your chemistries is super important. But I raise 14 different crops and I have 5 years between beets.
All right, that stubble's about a foot tall, and it makes it easier for irrigation and easier for planting that it's vertical like that. And he's not bailing it off. What the straw is worth in the market is not nearly what it's worth here.
There's probably some issue with maybe things take off a little slower on the no-till ground, but I think they catch up quite a bit in July when it's 90 and 100 degrees out. The soil doesn't get 90 or 100 degrees, it stays 60. I mean, if you walk out there and sort through the fodder and you've got 65-degree soil and the beets keep growing, you know, you'll really see it during the growing season. The leaves don't lay down like they do a lot in tilled ground.
One of the struggles is that early season vigor. You know, it's hard to watch those fields look ugly and be comfortable that they're going to catch up. It'd be nice if we could figure out a way to increase that. I'm sure, you know, by cutting lower, removing residue and stuff like that, that would help. But then you're giving up something on the back end. And we have a lot more season where it's hot than we do where it's cool. So I don't feel like that's a good way to compromise.
The microbes, the earthworms, they're all working for you to provide everything the crop needs. You get cooler soil, so there's less evaporation. You know, like Cavin said, you get more hot days than you do cold and wet days in Montana. And so it's better to start out cool and then have that soil cover, which we see here with all this great residue. Having this covered on the soil, that's great protection. It's great armor.
It's one of those things, if you're going to get out of it what you put into it. So, I mean, if you think you can just dump seed in the planter and go seed it, might work, might not, you know, but you got to get out and dig some seed, and you might have to buy some attachments for your planter, but you know, it's one less trip from the fuel truck they're paid for. So, and you know, maybe don't do the whole farm, but give it an honest shot on a decent field.
And every year since I've been doing this, I think, man, it isn't going to get any better than this. I mean, this is good. And the next year I'm surprised again that it's even that much a little better. I don't know if that day will ever come, but where it just stops getting better.
I guess I'd say try it. You know, you don't have to dive in and do 100% of your crop in year one. If you have a field that you think is more suited for it, try that field and just see what you think. Don't feel like you need to go all in on anything. You know, work your way into things.
My biggest advice is do a little bit the first year, you know, maybe one field. And when you plant, you got to have a lot of patience, because that's where I struggled and I thought was the hardest part of it all. If you just keep with it, it'll work out for you. Like I said, I've only done it 2 years and I've had great success with it.